This is the legend of a man named Carlos. Born and raised in Ottawa, Canada, Carlos was always fascinated by the art of public presentation. From a young age, Carlos would be mesmerized by the many TV broadcasts and announcers in front of the camera. Inspired, Carlos decided to pursue a Bachelor of Journalism at Carleton University. Despite the many twists and turns over the next 10 or so years, Carlos would build himself up with opportunity after opportunity. From play-by-play announcer to public address announcer to communications manager of prestigious clubs, Carlos excelled at every step of the way. Carlos was happy. And then one day, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity would cross Carlos's path. An opportunity that came at the right place at the right time. In 2021, Carlos received a call to do something very unique. Ring announcer of a boxing fight. Excited, Carlos would take the opportunity, and he would immediately set an outstanding impression on the promoters and audience. It didn't stop there. Soon after, Carlos would move from amateur fights to professional fights, and he would step in the ring for boxing, Muay Thai, and other MMA fights. In 2022, Carlos would announce his first international professional fight, broadcasted to the world on DAZN. With such a powerful presence, Carlos would become the ring announcer for United Promotions Boxing, and he would work with some of the best fighters in all of Canada, and even some of the best in the world. Carlos is the embodiment of the Carleton Ravens creed. He is intelligent and creative. He is bold and determined. He relies on teamwork, and he is always accountable for all the work he has done. He is a competitor that has fiercely proved his ability time and time again. He never gives up. He is committed to his life's work because Carlos is a Raven. Carlos is a legend. This is the legend of Carlos Verde. Carlos, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Amos, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here, and it's a very unique opportunity to look back at the various stops over the last 10 years. I mean, even just hearing you talk about the Carleton Ravens, that's so long ago and so many stops ago. But you do take a little something from every step of the journey along the way, and I'm really excited to get down into the nitty-gritty of that journey today. So thanks for having me on. I've listened to a few of the episodes, big fan of what you do. And I mean, obviously you're an excellent announcer in your own right and somebody that, I look up to in terms of a voice talent. So really happy to be on. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I really appreciate the kind words, Carlos, and thanks for coming on to the show as well. And as you mentioned with the Carleton Ravens, that's where we first met, actually. We first met back in 2015, all those years back, the same day that I met Cameron Penny, also on an earlier episode of the show. We met in the same place on the same day, M&P Park, formerly Keith Harris Stadium, at the very same men's soccer game.
The best, great memories. And one thing that's really impressive about Carleton athletics in that era is not just did you have phenomenal talent on the field. You think of those football and men's soccer teams graduating multiple players every year to the pro ranks of their respective sports, but I mean, there were so many great student workers, student journalists, student broadcasters, student announcers, student social media correspondents that were around Carleton athletics at that time. And it really created a dynamism around the programs that I've worked for a couple of different schools, but I do think that Carleton truly had a unique vibe back in that era, 2015, 2016. So many great young minds that were ambitious and already talented at what they did in the same room or at the same stadium. And that was such an exciting time.
It was. And many of the announcing skills that I developed over those years were actually from you, because you helped me a lot in getting my first step into play-by-play announcing in particular. And I can just remember back then you encouraging me to, talk to Taylor Pritchard about doing play-by-play for women's hockey at the time. And I was still at the time thinking, should I do it? I don't know if I felt comfortable doing it. But then you were like, just give it a try. And I'm very happy that I took you up on that and talked with Taylor Pritchard about this, because if I didn't do that, this podcast would not have existed, or may have existed a lot later down the line, but it would not have existed definitely now. So I really appreciate that, and really, I really thank you for that.
Of course, and let's be honest, it would have been a complete tragedy, a modern tragedy, if the world didn't get to hear this guy's voice, for another 10 or 15 years down the line. So for me, it was the nuances of hockey or soccer or whatever it was you were announcing. You might not have had them that first year, but the vocal talent and the ability to learn and adapt on the fly, that was something that was can't miss. And that's why Carleton was so happy to throw you on air right away.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that from you, and also from the Carleton Ravens, for giving me the opportunity, and for giving also both of us the opportunities that we had throughout the early parts of our career. And speaking about career, going back to your career, what inspired you to pursue journalism?
It was something that I'd always had an interest in. I always liked to talk. I always liked to write. Watched a boatload of TSN, Sportsnet, History Channel documentaries, Discovery HD, all that when I was growing up. And I think it was grade 10, the teachers in Ontario were in a work to rule situation. And I'd always been a kid that had played, if it was baseball season, I was playing baseball. And if it was soccer, it was soccer. But 12 months a year, I was playing one, sometimes two sports at a time. And faced with a lack of that in grade 10 in high school, because, a lot of those sports, volleyball, basketball, whatever, I only played them in a school environment, right? So not having that, I remember it was September 2011, and I was kind of sitting there. I think we'd been to Spain that summer before, so I didn't really realize that, teachers aren't going to be running sports. What do I do with all this time? That was my first thing. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about what's my passion. It was, what am I going to do to fill all this time in the fall of 2011 as a 15-year-old? Or I think I might have still been 14 at that time. And I just did some Googling, and all of a sudden, you know what? I think I'd like to try my hand at broadcasting hockey. So I did. I just sent a couple emails around to local junior B teams in the area. And before you know it, I was making, I think it was $35 a game, split 50-50 with my various color commentators who were all just buddies of mine. A lot of guys I played hockey with at that point would intermittently jump on a broadcast with me, and we'd make our $17.50 calling a game on internet radio for 8 people or 10 people, parents of the out-of-town players on teams like the Ottawa West Golden Knights, the Ottawa Junior Canadians. And it was at that point already in the fall of 2011. I was only in grade 10, but at that point I started shifting my focus already from playing sports all the time to how can I do more of this? How can I start covering junior hockey? How can I write about, the local baseball team? All of that, it really started for me in that fall of the 10th grade, which was 2011. And it all stemmed from the teachers being in a work to rule situation. And therefore, I didn't have access to year-round sports through my high school.
Yeah. And starting from that point, just 2 years later, you would work as a social media assistant in the 2013 IIHF Women's World Hockey Championships. Just 2 years later. So what were the most formative experiences of your time back then?
Well, I think in speaking about the tournament, that was my first experience doing anything on a larger scale, a national or international scale. And granted, women's hockey, I think it's fair to say, objectively was not back then what it is now. I believe 40 or 50% of the games in that tournament that was hosted in Ottawa in 2013 were played at the European Sportsplex in front of crowds of a couple hundred people, right? I distinctly remember, I think it was Sweden, Germany, or Sweden, Czech Republic in the relegation round. And so it wasn't the tournament that it is now, as evidenced by the nonstop sellouts in Brampton at Women's Worlds last year. But all that to say, it was a very formative experience for me because it was my first time dealing with international level athletes, women that had won gold medals, interacting with fans and being a representative of the IIHF at the arena at ice level. And for I think I was 16 years old at that point. I just turned 16. It was February 2013. I think the tournament was. It was an eye-opening experience, and it was also the first time that I was representing a larger brand. I wasn't just Carlos Verde, the junior B online radio announcer for a local team that averages 200 fans a game. It was, I have the keys to the IIHF's Facebook account, or, I'm posting to Twitter with crowd shots. And the fact that at that time they put that in the hands of myself and a number of other social media correspondents, but it just shows how much that was still the infancy of social media, that they basically gave a 16-year-old kid who had a year or two of experience and said, here's the password, knock your socks off. It was a really cool experience, but I think the biggest takeaway for me was what it's like to actually be representing and be responsible for curating content for a larger company. Even at that time, I think the IIHF had, probably 50, 60,000 followers on a lot of those platforms back in 2013. So definitely an eye-opening experience and a very, very fun one. I remember a couple of moments just interacting with athletes from smaller countries going, holy smokes, I've watched Team Finland at the Olympics, or I've watched Team Sweden win a bronze at the Olympics or World Championships, and here's, Sarah Grahn in net or whoever it was, right? That was a really, really neat experience at the time for me.
Yeah. And you mentioned social media. Yeah, that was, social media was already starting to get a lot more mainstream, but it was still the last of the early age of social media at the time, which is so fascinating to know, because at the time, Facebook and Instagram were the main social media platforms at the time, right? So, which, as opposed to nowadays where Instagram still has the strength, but many people have moved on to TikTok, which I refuse to use to this day for my own reasons, of course. But it's interesting how times have changed and how social media consumption has changed over time. And with those kinds of interactions between yourself and athletes, I would assume that was a very, very good primer for you going into Carleton when you were dealing with athletes on a much more interpersonal, in-person basis.
Absolutely. And it was something that I think every student journalist is going to struggle with, right? Being 17, 18 years old, a lot of the guys on the men's hockey team when I got to Carleton were, these 22, 23-year-old guys that I had watched as a 12-year-old playing for the Ottawa 67s or against the Ottawa 67s, idolizing in the OHL, right? So being on the bus with them to places like Montreal and Kingston and Trois-Rivières, as a wide-eyed 17, 18-year-old, those first 2 years at Carleton, it was tricky. And then on the flip side there was also the socialization aspect as you get into third and fourth year and you're the same age as these guys, you're the same age as some of the, girls on the women's team. Every student journalist that has any kind of social life is going to sometimes struggle with that, line of professionalism. And if you see somebody at the bar in the Byward Market and, where's the line? And when you're 19, 20 years old, it's tricky to navigate. But all that to say, I think it's pretty clear that, myself and Cameron Penny, and there were a few people around Carleton Athletics at that point in time that were basically given free rein, right, by the powers that be, the various SIDs that were there at the time in charge of athletic comms. I mean, I remember that first semester, fall 2014, I was broadcasting, live tweeting, and writing the recap all at the same time for CU Ravens. And I was a 17-year-old, right? So they said, okay, this guy obviously knows a little bit about this. He's done this for a couple seasons. Here are the keys, have at it, right? But nonetheless, it was a tricky line to navigate at times, right? But I'd like to think that on the whole and on the average day, I navigated it pretty well.
Nice. And why was Carleton your ultimate choice for journalism?
Well, at the time, it was definitely still seen as the number one school in Canada, Ryerson Sport Media. I think that was the first year that they'd actually had an incoming class of undergrads. So that program hadn't really been established yet. I applied, but ended up choosing to stay at Carleton. I also had a pretty extensive network at that point. I'd sat in on some shows at TSN 1200. I had connected already. By the time I made that decision in spring 2014, I think it was, I'd already made some connections at the Ottawa Sports Entertainment Group, which led down the line to internships and paid work with, the Ottawa Fury, the then professional soccer team in Ottawa. That would lead to the Ottawa Red Blacks, which led to the Canadian Football League. So I had an extensive network base already for a 17-year-old, and I just figured that it made the most sense to stay in Ottawa and try and build those networks even further and utilize them. And from this vantage point, you think, oh, if had I gone to Toronto or had I gone to Western, had I gone out west to UBC, maybe my path looks different. But ultimately, I'm pretty happy with how that experience turned out at Carleton.
Yeah, yeah. And as we mentioned earlier, we would meet at Carleton quite soon on, while in our respective careers at Carleton. I mean, as you know, I did my BA in law at Carleton at the time. And journalism, as you mentioned, has this reputation, this really good reputation at Carleton. And in fact, to this very day, Carleton has always been known to be one of the journalism centers for journalism hopefuls and future communications professionals. One of the centers, as I mentioned. So, first day at Carleton Journalism, how was it? And how difficult was it to stay in the program?
I think it was difficult because I made it difficult on myself. I'd loaded up so many extracurricular commitments. I think I was still playing hockey at that point recreationally. I was basically covering any sport I could get my hands on. And I know a few other people that fell into the same pitfall and did drop out of the program based on marks, because there is a cutoff, I think, at the end of year one and then maybe again at the end of year two. In terms of the first day, it hit me over the head that it was a very politics-focused journalism program. They try and churn people out to be political correspondents for the Hill Times and be general news reporters for CBC, wherever you might end up across the country. But that's their ideal graduate. There was very little tailored towards sports media. There was very little tailored towards somebody whose interests didn't necessarily align at the time with what the direction the general program was, which was that you're going to intern at the Toronto Star, and then you're going to take a $50,000 a year job at CBC Kitchener, and then you're going to end up at CBC Ottawa or CBC Toronto or CTV Calgary or one of the larger ones, right? That's generally how the program was, and that just didn't jive with my interests and what I had in mind for my career. So basically, by the end of the first year, I don't want to say I checked out of Carleton journalism, but I did enough to get by with, B pluses and A minuses. But I made sure that I constantly was acquiring other skills and interning at a young age and trying to keep up with my contemporaries at the artist formerly known as Ryerson, now TMU University. I just wanted to make sure that I still had some of those technical skills and hands-on experience in addition to the good base that Carleton journalism gave me.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because when I had James Duthie on the show back a few episodes ago, he mentioned that at his first year was very theory focused. So he struggled a lot with trying to get through that first year because he was a good student, he just did not like sitting in a classroom learning about the theory of journalism or political theory and all that kind of stuff, right? He wanted to be on the ground doing stories with a microphone. And I assume that's probably somewhat similar to what happened in your first year at the time. There was maybe a lot of theory. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Was that also a thing too?
Yeah, it was almost entirely theory. I think the first two of the 4-year program were, almost entirely theory based. And to this day, I think that the program has chased or cut or whatever verb you want to utilize. They've lost out on some good potential journalists and potential graduates and alums because, if you came in with a B minus and the cutoff was a B, they're canning you from the program based on whether or not you knew what year the printing press was invented and who invented it and that sort of thing. You didn't really get hands-on in that program until late in year 2, early in year 3. And frankly, I don't know if it's still set up that way, but it resulted in a huge disadvantage in the internship job market for a lot of people in my program at that time. Luckily, I'd gone out and gotten my own stuff from the age of 15, 16. So I had a writing toolkit. I knew how to edit. I knew how to speak on camera, rough video editing skills. I had those by the time I was 18, 19, but it wasn't because of the program, right?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, something that I don't know if you know this or I've ever told you this before in the past, but I actually got into Carleton's journalism program when I first applied for Carleton. But I did not spend a single day in journalism because the whole point of me, for me personally, was to go to law school eventually. And at the time, I didn't know anything about BA law. So I thought the closest thing to get into law school is probably, for me, for my, at least from what I'm decently good at, was through journalism, because a lot of the skills that you have in journalism are very transferable into law. Interviewing, talking on your feet, thinking on your feet, asking difficult questions, writing, being able to present, being able to present in front of a large audience and in front of a difficult audience, and being able to answer difficult questions. These are all really, really important advocacy skills and even written skills that you need in law school. So actually, at the time when I transferred over into law, that was, the better thing to do at Carleton. But where I was going at with this was that I don't envy what you had to go through with the cutoff of the first and second year in journalism, because we didn't have that in the BA law program. I mean, the only thing I had to worry about was to make sure that I had at least an A- average to maintain my entrance scholarship throughout all 4 years. Frankly, that was a bit easy to do. I'm not trying to flex, but that was one of the things. I was a bookworm back in the day, so I was just like cooped up in my own room. If I wasn't announcing a game, I was just cooped up in my room doing my own thing. But yeah, I didn't have to worry about having to leave the program if I didn't hit a certain cutoff point in the program. So I certainly do not envy that with what you had to go through in journalism. But it prepared you well.
It did. It did. The reality is that in real life, you do have to attain certain goals, whether it's professional, whether it's personal. And a lot of kids, I think, in the program struggled with it that first year. There were a lot of people that dropped out, a lot of people that without even kind of attempting to make it to that mark, they just threw their hands up and said, all right, screw it. I'm going to comms. This is or public policy or one of the other decent programs at Carleton. But for a lot of kids, they just couldn't. I don't want to say face that anxiety because, obviously it's very valid. And as we know more about mental health today, I wonder if maybe the program will change or make accommodations to that hard cutoff. But at the time, it was just, I remember seeing other kids walking into a quiz that was worth 5% or 7% on a Monday morning, and they would be like shaking. You could just see it on their face. And I never took it that seriously. And I managed to get through with the marks that I needed for the entrance scholarship to stay in the program. But I also think that maybe the balance of having so much going on outside of class maybe lessened the stress that I would have imposed on myself in that situation that a lot of other kids did too.
Yeah, the biggest thing about, as you mentioned, student mental health at the time is that you're essentially putting an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old in such a stressful environment where it's at that age, they may not necessarily have faced that sort of adversity yet, right? And this is on no fault of anybody. Honestly, it's just a matter of life, right? Everyone who went into university had their own life story going into it. Some of them didn't have, we all face adversity, but some of us faced more of it than others before and different types of it as well. So, especially for 18 and 19-year-olds, at that age, you're still a kid, right? You're still a kid. So you're still trying to find out your own identity and trying to figure out what you want to do and what you want to, and what eventually your best strategy of going through school is. And right off the bat, you're already faced with a very, very strong cutoff point. I see the point behind it, but I also see the reverse where it's like, whoa, like it's tough on the kids, it's tough on the kids.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether that kind of hard cut, I don't know if it still exists today, but I'm sure the program is going to have to continue being more flexible, especially because general enrollment in journalism programs across Ontario is down. I think it was Loyalist College canned their 2-year journalism program. The reality is that the industry cannot guarantee even a middle-class existence, right, for all of the kids that are currently studying and trying to enter the field, whether it's master's, whether it's a batch, whether it's a 1 or 2 year college program. So I think journalism programs are going to have to focus more on the skill set as opposed to industry knowledge moving forward, because as we know, very few journalists stay in the industry past the age of 30, 35. They move into comms, they move into PR, they move into, in-house reporting jobs, whether it's sports, whether it's large business firms, right? But you see very few people making a lifelong go of it in journalism in this day and age.
As you studied journalism there, for the next 4 to 5 years, you would cover the Carleton U Ottawa rivalry. And as listeners and viewers of the show would know, that's something that I've been talking about for at least a couple episodes now, because it is a massive part of the Carleton U Ottawa identities. What are your favorite moments?
Well, I think the one that stands out is the Panda Game Hail Mary from my very first, I think it was my very first year, 2014. Nate Bahar pulls down, I think it was a tip ball in the end zone, and it wasn't even sold out that year. So Panda Game has become this massive thing, and I think that's due in large part to the actual crazy nature of the game the 4 years that I was at Carleton. There was a walk-off field goal from Mike DeMagalo one year. Nate Bahar walk-off touchdown. But they were moments like that where in 2014, there were, let's say 15,000 kids were there. Every single one of them that was still in Ottawa studying the next year, I guarantee you, went back to the game and probably tried to bring a friend or two, right? Because it was such a wild ending. Everyone storms the field. And now that's the tradition. But in 2014, TD Place had just opened like 3 or 4 months previous. I was there. It was a Ottawa Fury game against the New York Cosmos, I think early July 2014. But it was a brand new facility, especially on that south side. And there was an energy in the city at that time. Again, still before the real rise of social media. I'd say like Snapchat was around, TikTok wasn't there yet. Instagram had just kind of started becoming something that dominated our lives as young people. And something about that era, Nate Bahar, 2014, storms the field. And I would argue that everything Panda has become, the flipping of cars in the Byward Market, not in the Byward Market, in Chapel Hill there, or whatever, Sandy Hill by U Ottawa, moving the kickoff time of the game up a couple hours to reduce drinking. Everything the game has kind of blossomed into. I still see it as blossoming because I'm young enough to appreciate when a rivalry game is relatively nuts. I think all of that stems from that 2014 game and just that run where Carleton would find a way for a couple of years there. U Ottawa would be pissed. And then as soon as I graduated, the roles reversed. U Ottawa has had incredible success in that game. But I really think that Panda was the most special thing that I got to be a part of year after year. And some great hockey rivalries as well. Carleton against Université de Québec at Trois-Rivières. UQTR, Carleton, they were basically the Toronto Maple Leafs to Carleton's Ottawa Senators. They were the playoff kryptonite. And just the personalities that were involved, the journalists in Trois-Rivières that would, be sending me Twitter DMs asking if I could ask their coach a couple questions post-game, and hosting post-game shows that 35 people would listen to in the Carleton Ice House, arena lobby as the players were meeting with their families post-game. We would be doing a post-game quote-unquote radio show on our iPhones direct to YouTube, right? It's great memories like that. But I would say Panda Game is definitely number one.
Yeah, that game, that Hail Mary reverberated so much across Carleton and across alumni that James Duthie himself even said, he mentioned to me on this podcast that he made it very clear to TSN that this needed to be on SportsCenter. It had to be on SportsCenter because it was legitimately a historic event, a historic play that, as you said, cemented what the Panda Game is to Carleton and U Ottawa students to this very day. And it still rings a very, very strong message even today, even now, 9 years ago, that was the time that it took place. I can't believe it's been 9 years since then.
That is a scary fact. And I think if you were to ask a lot of the other students that were around in that era that have gone on to, the NHL, CBC, CTV, myself with the boxing, if you tapped us on the shoulder in our day-to-day lives and said it was, you're looking at nine and a quarter years ago that happened, right? At TD Place, when the stadium was brand new, when the Red Blacks had just come back, professional football was back in Ottawa. It was really an era of optimism, not just around football, but Carleton was in the midst of the Dave Smart dynasty, which still almost is continuing to this day. But there was a real sense of optimism at that point in time in the city. Football was back. The alumni from both schools were heavily present. They were all draped over Lansdowne the morning of the game. Just phenomenal memories from those football fall afternoons, back in the fall of 2014, 2015, 2016. Some memorable teams across the Ontario Conference. And at that time, both Carleton and U Ottawa were among those teams that were in the mix. And it was super exciting.
Yeah. And Capital Hoops. That was a big one, especially, and I've said this many times on my podcast as well, the 2020 Capital Hoops Classic, the 1 point difference between both the men's teams and the women's teams. Well, the women's team was a 2 point difference, but it was down to the wire to the very, very last shot. That was wow.
U Sports, university sports, formerly known as the CIS, formerly known as the CIAU, is the most underrated spectator product in Canadian sports. Like, it's not close. You get a football game in a national final scenario, even a conference championship scenario in Ontario, Quebec, Canada West Conference. With good quarterback play, it's very watchable. Basketball and hockey, the top end has proven that they are at the same level as some of those top teams you see in the NCAA playing in Frozen Four or the Final Four. The product is there. Unfortunately, the marketing and the student buy-in isn't. And that's one of the great tragedies for me of my 13, 14 years now working in sports. I think the single biggest tragedy is how few people care about university sports in this country on a weekly basis.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was my next question. What were the greatest challenges that you faced in covering U Sports?
Well, I think there was the complete lack of any kind of journalistic standard or media practice, right? I was the only guy at most scrums in the preseason or the regular season. Occasionally, once U Ottawa and Carleton had their hockey rivalry back in 2016, you'd get CBC would show up on game day looking for some dirt. You would get, maybe somebody from each of the school papers, but all things considered, it was pretty standard for myself to be the only journalist in a scrum. And that was even on the basketball or football side. It was just a one-on-one interview. Same thing in minor pro soccer with the Ottawa Fury, right? There's 4,000 or 5,000 people at those games, but at the end of the day, there is one person talking to the coach in the media room at the Carleton Ice House, or two people, right? That was the biggest thing, was coaches and players a lot of the times weren't used to being covered. And I straddled the line between being in comms and working for the Ravens and also writing columns and recaps for the Charlotte, the school papers. So I would criticize the football quarterback, and then the next week the coach would, he'd have a little jab for me about what I'd written online for the school paper, right? So there was that in terms of me personally. That was a battle. And then at large, look, I remember men's hockey opening night, my first season. I was so pumped up. We've got all these guys that played for the 67s. They're in the lineup. They've just been recruited. Brett Gustafson, Ryan Van Stralen, players that I remembered watching along with 8,000 other people at a 67s game. And I remember Brett Gustafson coming out, red hot for the warm up. Or no, for the puck drop on opening night of my first year. And I was amped up because at this point I'd done 3 years of junior B, 2 years of junior A. And to me, I've graduated to this level that's even above the OHL. And I'm super fired up for my first broadcast. And I always remember Brett Gustafson comes out hot for his, first lap as the teams are coming onto the ice. And he takes his first turn, and I can see him looking up at the stands, and I can see the look on his face, because there was 55 people in the Ice House on opening night against, I think it was McGill or RMC that year. And, you're playing in front of parents and girlfriends and maybe a couple buddies from your geography class that live on campus, right? And I remember I was blown away by the speed of the game, and trying to call the game at that level was a challenge for me that first semester. But I'll never forget Brett Gustafson looking up at the Ice House stands and going, wow, there's 4 rows of seats here and only 2 of them are full. And it's the home opener, and there's 35 guys on the ice of the 40 here that played 5 years of major junior. And that is still a battle for university hockey in this country 10 years later. But that was something I struggled with too. Even by the end of my third year, the last year I was in the league, my third year of studies at Carleton, I was working for Ottawa men's hockey pretty much exclusively. And it was something I struggled with, that frustration of why don't more people care about this product, right? Super unfortunate. And I don't know what the solution is, but I would say personally, it was the lack of media training from the players and coaches' perspective, and just the intimacy of it, of knowing these people and being in class with guys from the football team and girls from the hockey team and still trying to report on them neutrally. And then at large, just the fact that not that many people cared about the product I was covering. By the end of year 2 and into year 3, it was sometimes tough to get excited to go to the rink, because I knew that I would see the same 80 people at the rink and the same 15 people, 1-5, would be watching online.
Man, I felt that. When you mentioned what Brett Gustafson went through, I felt that, because that's how I felt when I did my first play-by-play broadcast. And there were barely anybody watching in the stands, right? Well, first of all, the stands itself are quite small, right? They're only a few hundred seats.
Yeah,
the Ravens ice
something. Yeah,
the Ravens house only had about a couple hundred seats, but we couldn't even fill those, not even close, right? That is something that, again, I really felt that, because it really sucks when you feel really excited about it, but it's just you. Everybody else is just treating it as, I just have to do this kind of, this kind is had to be out here because it's for my buddy, but I've got like a better place to go to, that kind of thing, right? There's the passion that's for anything that is non-professional sport in Canada seems to be very, very lacking. And I think it's on a cultural level as well, because we don't have the same kind of reverence or the same kind of enthusiasm that the Americans do. For them, it's almost like a second religion to them. They swear and die by their own universities, even until their 50s, 60s, and 70s, until their dying breath, right? And I want to say it sounds extreme, but it's not. Many of them really do feel that, right? And for us to even have a fraction of that, is already leagues better of what we have right now in terms of the reverence and respect for it. And I remember you mentioned on a separate podcast, I forgot the name of the podcast, several years ago, talking about this point. Like, even Division III NCAA teams are leagues ahead of the marketing in terms of what we have up here in Canada.
Well, I'll give you the perfect example that I saw, over the course of my 5 or 6 years where I was locked into hockey. There were a couple of players, not exceptional ones, that went through the ranks in Junior B and Junior A locally in the National Capital Region, and I covered their careers. And 2017-18, I'm doing communications for the Junior A League, right? The league I used to broadcast in. I was the communications manager for the league at the age of 19 or 20 or whatever, and I was the same age as a lot of the overage players. That was a whole other, you talk about lines of professionalism, that's a whole other conversation. But I remember we went down on a trip with our all-star team from the CCHL, the Junior A League in Ottawa, and we went down to SUNY Oswego, so the State University of New York at Oswego. School you've never heard of, Division III, public school. You wouldn't expect huge alumni, huge anything. So we went down with an all-star team of our overage 20-year-olds. So a couple guys from Smiths Falls, a couple guys from Ottawa, a couple guys from, Cumberland or whatever it was. We put together a CCHL all-star team and went to Oswego. And Oswego had a couple of these players on their team, and they were now the captain and the assistant captain and the starting goaltender for this Division III school at Oswego. And I'll never forget going down and a guy who was a goaltender on one of the most historically bad teams in junior hockey history anywhere. In 2013-14, I think it was. He played for a really bad team in the Junior A League in Ottawa. 4 years later, I go down, run into him, do a little feature story. Oh, you and these other two guys from the league are here. That's great. And a fan walks by at SUNY Oswego wearing a personalized jersey with this guy's name and number on the back. This goalie who used to play in front of 35 people a night in Gloucester, Ontario, playing junior A hockey in Ottawa, right? And at that moment, we walk out into the rink, 3,000 people, sold out. They've got they bring out the flag and everyone's standing at attention for the anthem. They've got a giant video board. And I'm sitting here going, I've been all over Ontario and nobody has this setup. And this is just a Division III school that is playing, exponentially lower level, at an exponentially lower level than Ottawa versus Western men's hockey on a Wednesday night, or Carleton versus Queens on a Saturday night. But this guy was a god. Somebody had paid $250 to have a Cedric Hansen personalized jersey. And, to me, that was a moment where I went, it's just different. And it's the same thing in Europe. You go to England, Division 5 semi-pro soccer, they have 7,000 fans because people care more. It's more of a community bonding experience than it is in Canada. And to get some of that, you got to go to these rural junior towns like North Bay, Ontario. Nipissing women's hockey sold out a game this year. They gave the tickets away, but they had 3,000 people at a Nipissing University women's game. Why? Because it's a small town. There's nothing else to do. The players are out in the community. Darren Turcotte does a great job with, being involved in the community there in North Bay with girls hockey. But that's the difference, is a random D3 school in nowhere, New York State, has a multi-million-dollar video board and 3,000 people wearing their personalized player jerseys every night. And it's just different. Whereas we can only replicate that once a year at Panda, once a year at Cap Hoops, and that's it. It's just different. It's unfortunate. And I don't know truly, after 8 or 9 years reflecting on the topic, I don't know how you build that at this point, right? In Canadian university sports.
Yeah, I think it's cultural. Like I said, it's cultural. Like if it's a cultural problem, it's going to take more than just a couple of years of marketing to do that. It really will. I mean, as evidenced by what happened with Nate Bahar's Hail Mary, that certainly changed the impression to a very positive extent for how the Panda game was run. But that did not change much, at least enough, how football, the amount of attention that's being placed to football is, at least from a student body perspective. Sure. Now, they do tend to do better, I would say, on average, when in filling the seats and getting that kind of attention. But it's still not at a point where it's like, oh, this is like the cultural thing that you would see at Carleton, where you would see students like, hey, have you gone to this? Are you going to this football game? Yeah, no. You don't hear conversations like that, right? It hasn't hit that point yet.
Well, a perfect example is, I think it was a couple of years ago, probably pre-pandemic, maybe like 2018, 2019. Carleton and Ottawa played in the playoffs, and they'd played each other. The same two teams, the same 90 guys had played 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago in front of 22,500 or whatever at TD Place. Sold out, national TV, blah, blah, blah. They meet again in the Ontario Conference quarterfinal, and it wasn't a sellout at MNP Park. There were, whatever the announced attendance was, 650 people or 700 people for a game that objectively meant more to both teams. The same guys, same city, and they drew, if you crunch the numbers, what is that? Like 5% of the actual number of people, not even, like 3% of the actual number of people that were at TD Place 3 weeks prior for the Panda game, right? And I don't know how you fix that. I don't.
Yeah. And even outside of sports, honestly, it's also a problem even in the arts. Really anything entertainment related, Canada tends to do pretty poorly at when it comes to convincing their own citizens to go to that specific event. I mean, I've had an episode on here with Kirsten Leung, my cousin, who's also a violinist. And one of the things that I noticed from his career is that most of his performing venues and concerts are not in Canada, with the exception of Quebec, because Quebec tends to have a stronger European cultural influence and a foundation. So classical music is a lot better, at least in terms of the scene and opportunities there. But outside of Quebec, you don't see that many opportunities to perform in the arts world either. Kirsten is often in Europe, Asia, maybe the US. And the US is substantially better than us, and even on that. And guess what? Most of the classical composers didn't come from America. They didn't even come from the New World. They came from Western or Eastern Europe, right? So there's even that from an artistic perspective, which is very, very difficult. And like you said, it's there's no easy fix to it, but it is a problem that's been lingering on. I want to say it's more like a 30 or 40-year problem. This wasn't really a problem back in maybe the 60s or 70s, but somehow at some point during the Gen X era and the early millennial era, it just started fading away and nothing was ever done about it. It's this kind of reluctance to change, I think, that's causing a lot of problems. And I think you and I have also faced this as well when we've dealt with people who, great people, don't get me wrong, like great people, nice people, but when we're trying to push the envelope of something and they don't feel comfortable doing it, right? And I get it because you have a set formula that's always worked, but what if it didn't work for a long time and there's a better way to do it objectively, but, it's frustrating at times,
Maybe that's part of the issue in youth sports. There's a lot of very competent, very talented people at some institutions, but the overall sum of its parts, and you're only as strong as your weakest conference or your weakest school in terms of what your overall brand is in that scenario. And I think there's a lot of schools where complacency has set in. People might have started out 15, 20, 25 years ago with the best intentions, but after X number of years of always doing it the same way and having the same marketing approach or lack of marketing approach, they're not going to change after 15 or 20 years. Youth sports in Canada is basically the federal public service of sports jobs, right? You don't have the same deliverables in terms of ticketing, in terms of partnerships revenue that's due. You can very easily coast at a lot of these institutions and become very comfortable. So maybe that's part of the issue. But the years of me hammering away and banging on my tin can trying to get people to care or people in higher up positions has changed. I was an announcer at U of T for the last 3 years, and I happily showed up and worked alongside my student workers and made my $18 or $22 an hour or whatever it was. And I just did it because I like going to the rink. The time of me trying to change systemic issues in terms of university sports in this country are over, and I never see them starting again. It's unfortunate, but like so many people that have gone through it already, my era of, for lack of a better term, giving a shit is unfortunately, over, the same way it is for most of the journalists that move on and only come back to it when their university wins panned on a Hail Mary, or, come back and cover it once a year when the Vanier is on Sportsnet, right? But that's the reality. I'm now in that pool, and it's not my job. It's not my responsibility to keep screaming about it, thankfully.
Yeah. Thank goodness. And same here, honestly. I mean, like for me, like I still am involved with a lot of university sports to this day, and I want to be very clear on the record. If it doesn't seem clear, I still very, very, very much enjoy what I do. Like I mean, I'm so happy to be doing it. It's just that with with everything in life, there's always room for improvement in any profession, in anything that you do. There's always room for improvement. And well, I'm just airing out my own feedback, so to speak, right? So, but I want to be clear that I love it. So I want to be 100% clear on that point. I love it. So,
and in my case, I wouldn't have hung around on and off for 9 years if I didn't. And
exactly.
There might still be an era where if I move back to Ottawa and I have an opportunity to get involved at Carleton again, or even Ottawa, I'd probably love to do that just as a hobby. But the years of me spending back to back days at the soccer field, then the hockey rink, then the basketball court on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they're over. It's just, that's a reality of life. Great era, but it's over.
Exactly. Speaking about different chapters, you would move on to pro leagues. And firstly, that would be the Canadian Football League. How did you get the opportunity to work with the CFL?
So it's funny. I was driving through rural Alberta in the summer of 2016. Didn't know too much about. I mean, I'd followed the CFL a bit, obviously, as I'd been involved with OUA football for a couple seasons at that point. But I was driving down a rural highway in Alberta. I was interning for Post Media at a local newspaper, the Pincher Creek Echo, down just southwest of Lethbridge near the US and BC borders. So out there for that summer, and I got a call on my phone from a number I didn't recognize, and it was a Carleton journalism alum by the name of Jeff Creever. Awesome guy, went to bat for me and basically fell out of the sky with an opportunity to write recaps and game previews for the CFL website. So he'd read some of my stuff with, goravens.ca or whatever, and Carleton alum, Carleton journalism alum, and one thing led to another. And I think that year I ended up making more money freelancing for the CFL than I did actually from the newspaper that I'd moved to Alberta that summer to work for. So, I'd take care of my commitments, covering town council, covering a rodeo on the Indigenous Reserve, whatever it might have been. It was a super interesting role, also completely turned me off journalism, but that's another story. And then I would go home at night and I would watch games on TSN and I would cover them live. I'd be updating, the live score on the website. I'd be writing my game recap throughout so that as soon as the game ended, boom, we'd have a photo from our photographer in Calgary or Montreal or wherever the game was. I would drop that on top of the story, make sure all the links were right. And usually within 45 seconds or a minute of the final, the final whistle, final horn, wherever the game was, the story would be live on the CFL website. And that's what I did. So again, you talk about leveling up. I felt that responsibility. Here I am. I'm in some guy's basement that I'm subletting in a town of 2,500 people in rural Alberta. And, the Saskatchewan Roughriders are playing the Hamilton Tiger Cats. And I got to get this recap up within 30 seconds. And I'm getting paid at the time way more than I ever had. It was whatever it was, $75 a game or $100 a game or something. I was getting way more money than anyone had ever given me to do a game before. So I felt that responsibility. And that's how it popped up. I freelanced for the league for 2016 and 2017, wrote some CFL draft features going into the 17 draft. And then coming out of school, there was an opportunity, not right away, but I think it was sort of late May, early June 2018. I was playing baseball in Spain for a couple months right after I finished at Carleton. I was playing in kind of a semi-pro league there against some pretty good players, a lot of Cubans and Dominicans and stuff that had played at a high level professionally in the States and in the Caribbean. And yeah, I got a call that, hey, we're hiring a social media coordinator. The pay is whatever it was, $41,000 or $43,000 or whatever it was. And I said, yeah, no problem. I'm back in Canada on June 7th. I graduated on June 11th, and my first day at the CFL was like June 14th or whatever. So in the span of 8 days, I went from living at a townhouse in Spain to graduating from Carleton to moving to Toronto. So the year 2018 was a year of a lot of turnover, and it worked out for me. I spent 2 seasons at the CFL, and then I was ready for a change, and I think they were ready for a change in that slot as well. So it was kind of a situation where they gave me my marching orders, and I'd actually already had another job lined up at the exact same time. But overall, 4 great years, a lot of awesome friends and memories from that era, and people I still stay in touch with and consider good friends to this day. So great experience at the CFL. Wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah, and one of those things that you wrote for the CFL, one of the written pieces that you wrote for the CFL in 2018 in particular, was your time with Matt Dunnigan, who was, as you know, former CFL player turned TSN sportscaster. And I remember that piece was talking about recipes for Thanksgiving dinner. So how do you build rapport with someone like Matt Dunnigan? And what surprised you the most from talking with people like him?
So with Matty D, it was really easy because he's a down home guy, Louisiana type guy, total hospitality, top notch, family guy. And, I'd gotten to know him a little bit working Argos games, right? Seeing him in the press box at BMO Field, that kind of thing. And just a great guy. And I knew that he had done this cooking show before. So there was this treasure trove of, GIFable videos and photo and video content that was already out there. And I've always been big on, despite how much I valued, the preview and recap writing and kind of the nitty gritty and covering every team every week, all that. What I really enjoyed about sports and what I love about the boxing now is the ability to tell stories beyond the box score. That was always how I pitched myself. I would much prefer to write an 800-word feature on who this guy is away from football or beyond football. What's his family like? What's the food like? And that series, I think it was Third and Done with Matt Dunnigan. I think that was the series that we labeled it as, and the graphic design team, who was awesome at the CFL. Laura DePede led it. Marcus Farias was there. Matt Baldea. They were so good. And they turned around like a little logo for it too, which kind of was really fun, of Matt Dunnigan with a suit. And I think he was cooking up next to a barbecue. It was really fun. All that to say, you meet some incredible people. They make your job easier a lot of the time in sports, because they are they are personable, right? And they are characters. And sometimes, and Matt Dunnigan was an example of this, you sit back, you ask the question, and then you just let him, expound on the subject for 4 or 5 minutes. One of those great characters from the league, still occasionally in touch with him on Twitter. And again, great memory from that era. Yeah, another one was, I wrote a feature on 2 CFL fans, one from Ottawa and one from Calgary, who'd, they'd connected through this idea of the CFL family was big at that point in time. We had a little social community with kind of the diehards from every fan base. And Grey Cup Tweet Up was like a little meetup during Grey Cup week. Anyways, this couple had gotten married, right? And they'd met through the CFL, and it was just, I did a little story on them, and it kind of went mini viral. And it was just, you meet all kinds of great people. And that's what I remember the most from the CFL era. It didn't end great for me. I was pretty fed up with the role by the end. It was a bit of a grind in terms of the hours, and the pay was garbage, right? As most social roles were and continue to be. But super grateful for the people I met, and memories like that. Talking to Matt Dunnigan every week for an entire fall, like what a treat, right? Starting university blitz picks where we had current CFL players picking on upcoming U Sports games that weekend, and then creating a dialogue on social where current OUA players would be calling out their alums for picking against certain teams. And it was just an awesome era, a phenomenal era.
Phenomenal, yeah. And I remember reading about those stories, as I mentioned earlier, reading about those stories. That was fascinating from that chapter in your life. And your current chapter now, being communications manager for the York Club. What are the similarities and differences between this current role and your previous roles?
So I think the big things that you take away from working for the CFL or working for the Ottawa Red Blacks, where you're publishing content that's going out on social to 500,000 people, or in the CFL's case at the time, I think we were about 700K on social, is the importance of getting it right and reading over the tweet before you hit send. And in a high pressure environment, timely environment, game night, Grey Cup night, that was something that took a little bit of adjustment, because I didn't have the opportunity to spend an hour or two reading it over and glancing at it 6 or 7 times. So even today, I find that I don't make too many mistakes when I'm typing or when I'm speaking, because I had to be locked in when at the controls, right? That's a lot of responsibility to give to a 21-year-old kid making $40,000 a year, right? So I would say that the importance of getting it right. The difference is that now, instead of 700,000, it's just 700 members, and they belong to, probably the premier private dining club in Canada. The Terminal City Club in Vancouver is great. Petroleum Club in Calgary is great. Toronto Club here is also excellent in downtown Toronto, but the York Club is the creme de la creme. We're platinum club in the world, top 100 in the world. You can't afford to make that many mistakes, especially when you're putting together renovation project briefs or, preparing notes for the AGM, the annual general meeting, doing an interview with the club president for a printed magazine. If there's a typo in a printed magazine that's going to a membership that includes, the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and the, CEO of RBC, there's still a pressure. There's a pressure to get it right. It's different than having Sal from Moose Jaw calling you out for, misspelling the Riders quarterback's name. It's a different pressure, but it's still the same pressure to get it right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, how your previous roles with the CFL have helped with this, because that's essentially the biggest challenge that we all face in communications in general, right? Being able to get it right the first time and making sure that there won't be anybody who will be able to roast us. There's going to be people who will, but at least it better be within reason, of course. So the it's good also for you because I think it's not as there, at least to me, it doesn't seem like it's as intense or as issue ridden. I want to say I don't want to use. I think issue ridden is probably the best word to use because, as we mentioned so far, like there were issues with all the leagues that we have previously worked at, but it doesn't seem like there's the sort of intense, fast paced, 1 second done kind of pacing here with the York Club, whereas it's actually just it's just for 700 members and it's more laid back. It's for, I would assume, a general audience that is a lot older in life, maybe like their 50s or 60s, getting close to retirement, that sort of thing. So there's also that nice part of it as well, I would assume.
Definitely. And I think we talked about it off air when we met up for lunch last week. And one of the best parts of working at the York Club. So my transition from the CFL to the York Club went through 2 other private golf clubs in Toronto. So I was at Thornhill for almost 2 years. Then I got headhunted to Scarborough. I was there for about 6 months before I was headhunted to the York Club, where I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary. And it's fantastic. I love the team I work with. Cyril Duport is our GM. He used to be at the Ritz-Carlton. It's truly an elite private club. Like even within the club industry, it's top notch. And I've learned a lot from, whether it's the executive chef or the member relations event manager, seeing how they operate at that level has been eye-opening. Wearing a suit and tie to work every day has been eye-opening. But what I would say is, the best thing for me about the York Club is that it's forced me to expand beyond sports, right? From the time I was 14 years old calling games on the radio, I'd worked in sports. Working at a private golf club, you were still covering, what were our members that were playing competitively on the Canadian Tour or playing in the Ontario Amateur Championship. There was an element to that. I was still in a sports environment, right? There was the club tennis championship and the club curling championship and all that. At the York Club, I have a much more well-rounded job. Just in the last month, I've interviewed the artistic director from the Stratford Festival. I've had the opportunity to speak with the Parks Canada marine archaeologist who was the first man to dive on the Franklin expedition ships in the Arctic. So there's an opportunity to learn more. I'm much more in touch with the arts now. My partner and I are going to the opera. We're going to the Toronto Symphony Orchestra because I've been exposed to it in my work environment at the very top level. So 1, I'm very grateful for that. And 2, it's forced me to diversify my own interests, right? I'm much more in touch with history, with business, and certainly a lot more in touch with the arts than I was when I was purely a jock at the Twitter controls of the CFL 5 years ago, right? So I'd like to think I'm a much more well-rounded person, and that's due in large part to the opportunities that my full-time job affords me.
Yeah. And in general, that's what life does to you, right? As you get older, you get more exposure to different areas and different spheres, and you get to know and learn new things. That's what life does to you. And that's, I think, one of the beauties of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking about one thing to get exposed to, boxing. How on earth did you get the opportunity to announce your first fight?
So it was still the pandemic. It was kind of going into that winter 21, 22. And my cousin had been training his butt off at a boxing gym. That was what he kind of was doing during COVID in Ottawa Fight and Fitness, owned by Sasha Hijazi, who's a great guy, also an excellent promoter on the amateur scene in Ontario, does beautiful shows. They were just at the Marriott in Ottawa. They're doing one at the National War Museum. I think it's the 6th or 7th one they're doing there. In February, they just announced. So I get a text from my cousin saying, "Hey, do you want to talk to my trainer and the guy who owns my gym? They're looking for an announcer." And I said, "Oh, my cousin does sports announcing," and it was at the EY Center in Ottawa, out by the airport. Absolute blizzard of an evening. Everyone either had COVID or was about to get COVID because it was that second winter, right? Everyone's vaccines, I think, had just started wearing off. And anyways, so I go and I do this event, and it's perfect. A beautiful venue, high class for an amateur show. We had the blue corner would walk out of one entrance to the venue with blue lights, and then the red was coming from here. Fighters from all over Ontario, including one guy who it looks like may actually turn pro, potentially even on a United card in 2024, was the very first fight of the night. It was a knockout, and he was the first fighter I ever introduced. His name is Dylan Hutchison, and he's a heavy guy, hits hard. I think he's 9-1, 10-1 as an amateur. It would be very special to announce his pro debut because he was the first amateur that I ever brought into the arena. So that would be super special. But I did a few amateur shows for them through 21, in early 22. I think I did 4 or 5. And that's just where it started. And obviously it's led to the pro level. And I've been able to not leverage, but I've been able to bring some of the writing and the social background that I have. And I've been able to bring it to United and bring it to professional boxing, which in and of itself is experiencing a renaissance here in Ontario. So for me, I feel like I got in at the right time with the right company. We got the right management team in place, and really, really excited for what's ahead in the boxing world.
Nice. And glad to hear that it's such a fascinating and such a beautiful environment to be in, because to me, and probably to the average person, it may seem intimidating at first, right? So your first time stepping into that ring all the way back in Ottawa, what were you feeling as you were holding that mic in the ring?
And again, it was a big song and dance. There was, they probably had 600-700 people in there. It was packed from the first fight. I think my cousin was fighting third or fourth. And, it's an amateur show. You don't have the weights. You don't know what the guy's record is or girl's record is. So you have fighting out of wherever the gym is and the gym. So fighting out of, Scarborough's Diamond Muay Thai or Toronto's Diamond Muay Thai, fighting out of, Pembroke Boxing Club, here is so-and-so. But I remember it was flying by the seat of my pants, and I was fighting. I think I had some laryngitis or something going on, and so my voice was hoarse. My throat was hurting. I kept running backstage to chug water out of these paper cups, and the event started. My cousin won a split decision, and it was bananas. There was some real nerves, but once I'd done it, the first couple fights, by the fourth or fifth fight, by the time my cousin came out, I was good to go. And I didn't really have nerves again the rest of the way at the amateur level. Wow,
that's great. And then your first international pro fight on DAZN. What was that like?
That was a different experience altogether. I'd called up. I sent emails to, I think there were 4 active promoters in Ontario at that point for boxing. And I didn't really have a ton of interest in MMA. I'd done some Muay Thai, but professional boxing, it's classic, it's classy in the right environment, it's historic, and it fits more with what I want to do. So I sent out a couple emails to, I think it was the 4 promoters that were active in Ontario at this point in time. We're talking September 2022, late September of last year. And Tyler Buxton from United was the only one to get back to me. The rest didn't answer on social, didn't answer on email. And Tyler, who already operated along with, his co-owner or whatever their agreement was, him and Don McDonald were the faces of United Boxing at that time. The oldest, largest, best outright promotional company in Ontario. They do the most shows with the most fans, deepest roster of professional fighters, most guys operating at a high level, North American, international type level. And he was, the number one big fish at the top of the food chain, was the only guy to get back to me. And so Tyler said, "Hey, I can do one better than you asking to shadow my guy. How do you feel about a 1-fight tryout on international TV on DAZN?" And, I'm sitting there in the parking lot of the York Club taking this call going, yeah, 100%. I'm in for that. And in the back of my mind, I'm going, oh my God, DAZN. Oh my God, the Brampton Hockey Arena. Like, there's going to be 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people there. And this is going to be on around the world. And it snowballed. By the time I did my first fight, I think it was November 10th or 11th of 2022. My cousin had come down from Ottawa for the fight. My girlfriend and a bunch of her friends had bought tickets. I think there was probably 12 of us or 14 of us there total. I get in the ring, and Beto Duran, a guy out of LA, Mexican-American guy, awesome, well-traveled, blow-by-blow, play-by-play guy, does LA Dodgers baseball. Like, he's a top-notch, world-class guy. He was doing the play-by-play that night. And it was my first time doing a fight. And I did not know at a pro level, when there's a camera up top, kind of where center ice would be. There's also a ring camera. I don't know where to look. I don't know where to stand. And Beto Duran is looking at me, ready to throw it up for the decision after the first fight. I think it was Mehdi Abidi against Rudy Rene, just two, club level guys from Ontario. Mehdi, I think, went to 2-0 with the win. Rudy was a well-traveled guy from Ottawa, actually. He's worked out at my cousin's gym many times. And he's ready to throw it up to me in the ring for the decision. And, in the amateur game, you just kind of get up there, you stand wherever, there's no cameras, you say the winner out of the blue corner or the red corner, whatever. And I'm sitting there and I'm realizing, oh my God, I have to run this show. I got to point to the bell. I got to be ready to go and facing the camera and all that. And so I didn't know where to stand for the first 2 or 3 fights. And Beto was trying to point at me and stuff. And I'm like, oh God, what am I doing here? Right. But by the 4th or 5th fight, I knew what I was doing and I was fine. And then after the show, I said, tell me, man, like, what'd you think? And he goes, Jesus, is this your first time doing it? And I literally said, yes, this is my first time. So, I really thought that I'd screwed up. And, so whatever, I get paid at the end of the night. All good? Tyler goes, all good. And so a couple days later, I said, what did you think? Right. And I asked Jason, our creative director, the same thing. I said, what did you think? And he goes, Jason said, there's some room for improvement and stuff. But Tyler said, you're our guy moving forward. Right. So it was at that point that I became the voice of United Boxing, and I feel extremely grateful to be part of that team, because it was not pretty on opening night. I battled through it. My intros were good, but the reading of the decision, look, at the pro level, it's just different, right? Everything you're saying, especially in that environment, is being watched. People are going to go back and watch this. These records are going to go on to BoxRec and go on to these guys' Wikipedia pages. What you say is the record, is the note of record forever. The fights from 1950 that you can go back on BoxRec and find who Joe Smith fought Billy Greb and blah, blah, blah. That's what I'm doing. I'm now writing, it is being committed to record, and I have to relay it from the Ontario Athletic Commission into the record book. And so that's a big responsibility. And I feel that every time I get in there. I don't get nervous anymore, but those first couple fights, November, January, even February, we had a big show back in Brampton, big crowd, 3,500, 4,000 people. And, I did feel that. I still feel the responsibility, but there were serious nerves when I started out.
Yeah. And you mentioned how it's just a whole different environment. It's, as you know, it's one thing to read out an intro that's just simply written there and then just read it to a couple of people at your local concert or at a local event. But it's an entirely different thing when you're on that stage with blazing bright lights into your face, with a camera also on your face as well, in front of thousands of people watching in the stands, and then potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions, watching internationally on DAZN. That's a whole different thing. It's a whole different thing. And I can only imagine, especially being your first fight, my goodness, getting those intros through, getting through the decisions, and making sure you don't screw up reading the decisions too. Because if you do, oh my goodness, that's gonna. I mean, I can already picture a hypothetical scenario where there's a ton of news articles saying, "Oh, ring announcer messes up decision."
It's happened. It's happened. Not to me, thankfully. Knock on wood, not to me, but guys at the high level that I know personally and have met a couple times that, they've done stuff on DAZN. They've done stuff for Golden Boy Promotions and DeBella Entertainment and whatever it might be. Everybody has their moment, unfortunately, and it's minimizing those moments. So luckily, I haven't had any major screw ups, and United has been good enough to kind of keep giving me that opportunity and expand it. Right, I'm now the communications manager. I'm writing the fight press releases. I'm helping out on social media, so I'm able to bring my background into the pro boxing sphere, which, as far as I can tell, hasn't had a ton of, I don't know if it would be called consulting or expertise in the social media sphere, but boxers are huge commodities in their own right. They're huge brands in their own right, even within Ontario. A lot of them have 10,000, 15,000 followers. And it's how do you harness that, and how do you enhance their profile while simultaneously helping the promotions brand as well?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a difficult job to do in general, but thank goodness for your previous experiences in all these different areas of sports. It just comes naturally, right? It's second nature to you at this point. So, I mean, man, I remember seeing that first social media post when you did your first boxing fight, and then soon after your first international fight. I'm like, wow, that is incredible, right?
It was a large jump, and one that, luckily I think if I had only done, the year or whatever it was of amateur shows, and I didn't have the background of having done hockey on Rogers TV and having done a couple American Hockey League games and NCAA Division I games at St. Lawrence, if I didn't have that previous level of public speaking, if I hadn't done public speaking at that higher level, where in an NCAA environment, there's 5,000 people at the rink, and there's a video board to distract you, and there's all sorts of resources and possible distractions. A boxing ring is the same, right? You're taking cues from the athletic commissioner. Are the doctors back ringside? Can we continue with the next fight of our show? You're taking cues from the promoter. Maybe you have to recognize a former champion that's in the crowd, and that just gets inserted mid-show. There's a lot of different things to manage, not to oversell the importance of my role, but there are different things that you have to manage. And then if you're on broadcast, if you're on DAZN, if you're on pay-per-view, who is directing you? Who's giving you the timing? Are the play-by-play and color commentators done with their wrap from the last fight? There's lots of things that go into it that I think the average viewer probably doesn't think about or isn't aware of.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because this next question that I'm about to ask is something that I've asked for every single profession, but especially in sports where you and I have worked in. There are so many misconceptions that we have faced from other people who don't know about our profession. And it's basically, what are the greatest misconceptions that you have faced in your career? But I think, like, for you and for me, because especially for the first four or so years, we faced a lot of the similar things that we can probably talk together about this on this point, because as you mentioned, there's so much that goes into a production of any kind, in any sport, in any kind of production, in a broadcast, that people just don't know about. The biggest misconception that I've heard, even when I was still at Carleton, was that, oh, you're just on a microphone and you're just saying stuff on the microphone. No. You had to do so much preparation for whatever sport, regardless of the level, regardless of who's playing, where it is, how many people are watching or listening. You got to do your preparation. And many people think it's just super easy, when really it's not.
I think preparation is something that our generation struggles with too, right? Putting in the hours. Look, it's one thing to perform when the lights are on or your audio's up and you're reading out the starting lineup at a Guelph basketball game in your case, or, on the night of a fight, I'm announcing, a Mexican fighter that has flown in and is fighting an 8-rounder against one of our Canadians. But that's not when the work starts. The work doesn't start when you flick on your mic. In my case, it's looking up their box rec, understanding where they're from. If they have an indigenous pronunciation, Nezahualcóyotl or San Juan Teotihuacan from Mexico, it's doing the research, because I'm not of a Mexican background. I don't know how to pronounce some of those indigenous names, and I want to get them right. And I don't want to have to ask a boxer, or in your case, you don't want to ask a coach the day of a game, hey, can I run through, how do I say your name? Because that there's a YouTube video interview with that coach already that you can go find how to pronounce his name beforehand. And you can say, hey, Coach Pockernick, or Coach Trivedi from U of T basketball. If you can establish that you already know where they're from and you already know how to say their name, probably the most rewarding experience in boxing for me so far in the year and a bit I've been in it is translating for and getting to know Mexican and Argentinian boxers that come here as the B-side fighters, but I now have friends all over the world. And part of that stems from the very first time I met them. I knew, hey, you just won the Mexican championship last year. I'd call him champ when I met him. Or, I know that in your last fight, you fought in Puerto Vallarta against this guy. And having that research done ahead of time. And it was the same thing, I'm sure, for you in hockey too, is being able to show the coach that you care and you've done your research is going to grant you a level of trust and access and potentially keep the door open to that relationship growing. When if you just walked in and said, so coach, how'd your last game go? Or like, oh, did you guys win or lose last night against Ottawa if they're coming into Carleton? If you don't do that research, why should the coach give you the time of day beyond the bare minimum? Or why should the fighter, in my case, open up for an extensive one-on-one interview so I can write a good feature for the fight program ahead of time, right? So it's all about relationships when you're in media, when you're in public speaking, and a key portion of that is preparation. So I think you're absolutely right. Preparation, people have a misconception that the work starts when you turn on your mic, or when in my case, when I point to the timekeeper and he hits the bell and I start speaking. The preparation starts weeks before that, when I'm, prepping my notes, prepping my program story interviews with both Canadian and the Mexican fighters, right? I like knowing these guys and girls before I see them at the weigh-in the night before the fight.
Yeah.
And so preparation is just so key.
Exactly. And another thing that I think we had to face, especially, and I think we still do this now because we're still very young, we're still in our 20s, but especially when we first started out at Carleton or any of the other leagues, the age factor is also very off-putting for much of the staff, especially those who are more senior. And I experienced this more to a certain extent outside of U Sports, not as much in U Sports, thank goodness, but even outside of U Sports, especially when you're dealing with people who have had so much experience in that area. All of a sudden, now you're getting a guy from outside of the sport who is so young, and sure, he has some skill sets and some experience from doing other sports, but he's still, it's that kind of age gap where they don't take you as seriously as if they would take another person of a similar or not as big of an age gap, rather. It's that sort of perception that I think is also a continuous problem that we face. And this one, admittedly, is not an easy one to address.
The biggest issue that I found with my age was not so much like when I was 15, 16 and covering junior A hockey, junior B hockey. And again, you spoke about it not really impacting you in U Sports. That's because 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, that coach or that player is just really happy that they're being interviewed, that somebody cares about their product enough to sit down, take 20 minutes out of their afternoon or evening and talk to them. But what I faced when I went, and I think another one of the pre-show questions was talking about what's the difference between working at the amateur level and the pro level. When you come in like a bull in a china shop, and that's what I was. When I was 21 and I got hired at the CFL, I had all these ideas. I thought I knew how the world worked, and a lot of the ideas were valid and should have been, and some were successfully implemented at that next pro level. But there's a lot of people, especially the ones that are more than a couple years older than you, and especially in kind of the mid-management or senior coordinator type roles, where if they see somebody younger than them that is technically more able, maybe better with people, there will be an element of people being threatened, and they will feel threatened by you and your ideas, right? And that was something that when it came to navigating office politics and playing nice with everybody, that's something that it took going through probably 2 workplaces, I would say the CFL and Thornhill, before I got to a point where I now recognize how to have generally healthy relationships with everybody across the organization. I was very close with certain people at the CFL at the time, but there were a couple people in the office that didn't take kindly to me coming in and being a better writer and having different ideas and excelling at social media. And so there was an element within the building of being threatened and then being, trying to downplay my role on certain projects. And that's just, that's a challenge that you face, right? Not so much now because I've kind of ascended to a level where I'm on the management team. I'm interacting on the same level as our food and beverage manager or our chef, and the GM is right there. There's nobody in between. There's nobody filtering the messages. But when I was 21, 22, and I was ambitious and I wanted to rock the boat and create change a little bit, I ran into a lot of resistance at the CFL. And that's, ultimately why, things, and we ended up going our separate ways in whatever it was, October of 2019 or November of 2019, was just because I had ideas, and it was an organization that I think time has proven overall is pretty resistant to change. They're getting better now coming out of the pandemic. They've cleaned house in a lot of roles, but it was an organization that was resistant to change. And I think that's part of the reason that the league found itself in the hole it found itself coming out of the pandemic, right? Is struggled to adjust and struggled to kind of engage with that 30 to 45, 20 to 45 demographic.
Exactly. And and unfortunately, that's what life throws at us. I think many of the listeners and the viewers in the audience are going to relate to that, because this is quite universal across every single profession. I see it in law. Many of my doctor friends see it in the medical profession. The feeling of jealousy, the feeling of competition and being threatened, that thing certainly hurts on a personal level, but it can also hurt on an institutional level, right? And in the world of sport, you can see the extent of damage that it can do to specific leagues, to specific organizations, when it becomes too much, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there is sometimes, when we were all young. So, I mean, it's perfectly fine to be ambitious. Like, I was ambitious too. And I think many of our audience members were also ambitious and may still be ambitious even to this day and age, right? And don't get me wrong. There's sometimes good reason that maybe not all of the ideas were implemented, at the time. But there comes a point, and again, you see this with certain organizations, where they ignore so much of that feedback, where they're so resistant to improving. I'm not talking about change for the sake of change. I'm talking about change for the sake of improving, genuinely improving the product, the general work culture, the general flow of that area. That shows. And there are some sports, I won't name those sports, of course, but there are some sports at the professional level even, where organizationally, they have the potential to be huge and they have the huge social media presence. But when it comes to the in-person factors or the sponsorships, you don't see them. You just don't see them. And of course, it's a very complicated picture, but I think one big picture is the fact that there's stuff like this happening, where there's so much resistance to improvement, to genuine improvement, that it's literally causing them to shrink or downsize. And that is very disheartening, especially if you're a person who wants to genuinely see it improve, who wants to see the place grow, when you're seeing it do the opposite of that. It's so heartbreaking.
And talking about the personal struggles with that, I think is very important, because so many young people that are ambitious in any industry tie themselves to, I am my work, and my success is defined by my professional success. When I was at Carleton, the men's hockey coach was Marty Johnston. Fantastic guy, family guy from Ottawa, now an assistant coach with the Winnipeg Jets, has been in the National Hockey League for a long time now. And I remember the summer I was departing, I told him, Marty, thanks for everything. I'm taking this job at U Ottawa. They're, doubling my pay. They're making me exclusively part of the men's hockey setup, all the things I wanted at Carleton and couldn't get. And it hurt me inside having this conversation. I went into his office in June of whatever it was, 2016. And it was tough. I said, man, this is really emotional and stuff. And it was, because I'd been around for 2 years for everything, right? On the road, at home, all of it. Playoff runs, heartbreaking, everything. And I remember Marty Johnston, National Hockey League assistant coach, gave me one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever received from anyone. Not a likely source, objective, X's and O's hockey guy, meat and potatoes hockey guy. But he said, Carlos, you cannot ever in life allow yourself to be dictated. You can't allow your happiness to be dictated by one thing, especially when it's something like a professional stop that somebody else can take away with you based on numbers or based on a personality clash. I remember him saying that very clearly. You cannot put all of your eggs in one basket. And it was a very simple conversation. I was only in his office for 10, 15 minutes, but I remember walking out of that office going, he's right. I am more than whatever I'm doing right now professionally. And I have shared that advice with so many people. You know, young journalists reach out, young broadcasters reach out. And the reality is that your internship at Sportsnet or your $40,000 entry-level job at MLSE can be taken out from under your feet at any point. And it's important that you are able to derive your happiness from more than just that one stop on your professional journey. And frankly, as you get older into your late 20s, early 30s, you know, you build relationships, your friendships change. You might live in different places. You might have different interests, but it's super important to diversify beyond what you are as a profession, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all have different interests, and it's healthy, in my opinion, to have a couple of different interests outside of work. And that's something that young people our age, I think, struggle with, especially when you're in media or law, a profession that's really all encompassing, right? It can be a battle, but I wanted to get that piece of advice from Marty Johnston in there because he left me with it, you know, over 7 years ago now. And it's something that I have spread amongst my network. And I just think it's a great message because until you're the CEO, you never have full control over what your job looks like a month from now, 6 months from now. You don't know if you'll have that job. So tying your happiness to one thing is just, it's not sustainable and it's not healthy. And I would share that message with any late millennial, you know, or younger person.
So important. So important. I'm so happy you brought that up because, as you mentioned, this also applies to every other profession. And speaking as a lawyer, this is the biggest problem that I think many law students face in law school. Because once you're in 1L, and especially as you get into 2L, all you hear about is OCI, 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 Bay Street. Got to get to the Bay Street. Got to get to Seven Sisters. Get the best possible opportunities. If you don't get this job here, you're not going to get a job ever again. That is so wrong. That is so wrong. And I cannot even begin to count the number of times that people have been so stressed out in law school because of not being able to get an OCI position. And as I mentioned to you back in our earlier lunch, a little earlier back, law is a very competitive environment. So competitive. And you got to remember that most of these people, not all these people, are people who've done really well in school. Like top of their class, gold medalists even, you know, university medalists, right? So for them, they've always expected to, it's always been done. If I've always been the best, then I got to be the best in this thing as well. It's so competitive. And it plagues their mental health. And I knew of a few people who aren't here anymore. Seriously, they're not here anymore.
Well, I'll tell you right now that if I hadn't received that advice when I did, in terms of not putting all your happiness in one professional basket, you know, Monday I get a pink slip from the CFL. It's November 28th or 2019. Now I knew I had a job lined up, but if I hadn't, if I was still set on working in sports and working in social media, and my world had just crumbled. And that was an all-encompassing job. You're talking 65, 70-hour weeks. You're in the office Monday to Friday, and guess what? You got to work Friday and Saturday night if there's games. And if I had not received that advice and didn't have that perspective in terms of what mattered, you know, family, other interests, if I had been left to flounder, unemployed as a sports media, you know, social media person, that had just been let go from his job in a city that I wasn't familiar with. I'd only lived in Toronto for 2 years at that point, not even. It could have gone south very fast. And I'm not somebody that's struggled with mental health, thankfully, but I have a lot of sympathy for those who do, because in that scenario, if I had put all of my eggs in that one basket at the CFL, my whole world would have crumbled. And I don't know what the next step would have been, right? So if I don't get that advice when I'm 19, I am so much more vulnerable after that first professional. It wasn't even a blow up. It was, it was an amicable split and stuff, but I would have been so vulnerable at that point in time as a 23-year-old, right? I don't know what I would have done next. I don't know where my life would have gone. Instead, I was able to take a step back and say, hey, I'm going to change industries. I'm going to see what's up. And, here we are 4 years later. I'm making twice as much money. I have better work-life balance. I've discovered this unbelievable world of professional boxing, which I'm privileged to be a part of. And all of that is because of advice that I got at the Carleton Ice House in 2016. All of this is possible because I got that one piece of advice before I needed it.
Yeah. And another thing that I also wanted to bring up, and this is more based on my own ethnic background, as an ethnic Chinese person, I'm very, very lucky to have had a very, very supportive family and support group that has helped me through so much in my own career. But I cannot say the same for many other Canadian-born Chinese, Chinese Canadians, those who are of an ethnic Chinese descent. I can't say the same for them because in our culture, I mean, I hate to say it, but the stereotype is actually kind of true. Like for us, it's only really three careers: doctor, lawyer, engineer. I would even say the lawyer profession is starting to fall off. So it's really doctor and engineer, right? And we were talking about the issue of not tying so much worth to your one profession. This is a big problem in my culture. It's a massive problem, right? And I want to be clear, there are many lessons that I think we can learn from Chinese culture, but I think if there's one big lesson that Chinese culture can learn from, it's this. Because so many people in my own cultural diaspora that I know feel as if they have failed at just 15 or 16 years old simply because they don't want to be a doctor, they don't want to be an engineer, and maybe in some cases, they don't want to be a lawyer. So many of them have felt like they have failed. And they haven't. They have not. They barely even live life. They haven't even gone to university yet. But I get where many of the parents are coming from. Many of the parents want their kids to go into relatively stable professions that pay well, that have a certain level of respect, because these are respectable positions from a social standpoint. I get that. But what if your kid isn't made for that profession? And I tell people this, speaking as a lawyer, law is not for everyone. Don't go into law because your parents are telling you to go into law. You need to genuinely ask yourself whether or not law is for you. And I say this with their parents, in front of their parents, because I want them to know that this is not an easy life. Again, I've known people who aren't here anymore. They're not. So what good is forcing your own kid to go into a profession where they're not even going to be here anymore? Right? So then you're in the worst possible situation. You lost your, in some cases, only child. It's not worth it, right? So this is a lesson that I think many parents need to be very mindful of, because in this day and age, especially, even the traditionally stable professions aren't so stable anymore. And COVID is an example of that. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's not that you're not good enough. It's just the economy is terrible at this point in time, and it most likely will be for the next many years.
All super insightful points. And I think there's two things that I would say is, one is, I think this generation that's coming up, even us, I think people in their mid-late 20s now are prioritizing more work-life balance. It's no longer about, for most people, working at X employer or Y employer. It's what will X or Y employer allow me to do? Salary-wise, work from home-wise. In a lot of industries, even in downtown Toronto, you're seeing that now, right? Where it is the labor's market right now as opposed to the employer. And there's an element of self-determinism, right? People are willing to make their own way. They're willing to bounce between jobs. I'm a prime example of that. Just kind of hopscotching through a couple of different private clubs, arriving at one that worked for me. I'm very blessed to walk to work in Toronto and walk to groceries and be in an environment and have a job that allows me to live in that environment, to afford that. A lot of people don't have that, but there's an element of self-determinism where employees have more self-determinism at their fingertips than ever before, right? They can hopscotch jobs, they can negotiate, they have more leverage. The other thing too, and it goes back to that idea of previous generations as ideas. Like, most of my buddies, his families, mine, there was generally an expectation that you were going to go to a 4-year university and you were going to have some kind of professionalized career, right? Where you could point to a paper on the wall and say, I trained for 4 years and I'm going to do this job. I'm going to be a journalist. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be an accountant, whatever it might be. Now there's so beyond the self-determinism, there's also an element of non-traditional work, right? I've got a younger cousin who, he does some trading. He works construction. He does some manual labor jobs. He's a security guard, et cetera, et cetera. He never does anything for more than 4 or 5 months at a time, but he's in a position financially where he's already socked away way more money than I could have dreamed of when I was 19 years old. So I think there's the self-determinism where this is the first generation that's really taking their own professional life into their hands. For the most part, not every culture, not every profession is like that, but you're seeing that shift across most industries. And then the other thing is that idea that, hey, mom, dad, my non-traditional, whether it's crypto trading, whether it's, all of the different savings mechanisms that are available to young people in Canada, TFSAs, FHSAs, RRSPs, all the tax breaks you get for contributing to those. There's so many different ways to accumulate wealth now, and the traditional linear pathway is no longer the be all end all. And I'm really excited to see how this creative generation under you and I is going to come up with the money to own homes and take trips, because I think it's going to look super different than our parents' generation, and probably even different than you or I's pathway. Like, you or I are still on generally traditional pathways, right? We have full-time 9 to 5, or in your case, 9 to 9 jobs, right? And that's where we derive most of our income from, and we pursue our interests on the side, and that's that. I think the generation coming under us is going to be fascinating in terms of how they find their $80,000 or $100,000 a year, because it's going to look different than it did for us.
Yeah, and I hope it does go well, because for me, I'm a part of this group called the Millennium Alliance for Humanity in the Biosphere. And basically what the group is talking about, for short, it's called the Mob, MAHB, the Mob, but it's not, it's not the whatever.
Not organized crime.
Yeah. So the Millennium Alliance, I'll call it for short. So it's at Stanford University. One of the biggest problems that the Stanford group has seen is that we're running into something called the human predicament. And the human predicament is not just a climate change or an environmental problem. It's a human problem, in the sense that even the economy and our health systems and all that stuff is starting to fall apart, actually. So one of the arguments that I read from them, I think this is a guy named Professor Nate Hackins. He also runs his own podcast called The Great Simplification. He talked about how essentially oil has very much blown our global economy all the way up to such a massive extent. But we really started peaking around the 1970s, actually. So right around the 1980s, that's when credit started becoming a thing. And then what we did was that we used debt-based currency and debt-based financial practices to keep that growth factor up, right? And it worked for about 20 or 30 years. Nobody really noticed much at that point, with some pretty bad recessions, but it wasn't, really bad. But the cracks started crackling even more, up to the extent where now we cannot ignore this anymore. It is impossible to grow infinitely. Now we're at a point where we're actually forced to downsize. One big reason is because since the 1970s, our oil extraction has been going down. even with new alternatives, we're actually they're not they wouldn't even classify as petroleum even, right? Or oil or on that point. So like our energy output has been steadily decreasing for the last 50 something years. And because we don't expel enough energy, our supplies aren't as cheap as they used to be. So, for example, when food and everything started getting more expensive, a lot of people said, "Oh, it was just the war," and it is true. I mean, what happened in what's happening over there in Ukraine is an example of that. But it's more than just that. It's more than just that. That was just the tip of the iceberg. In reality, life is actually starting to become more and more unaffordable because we don't have the same ability to transport everything that we did even 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Like it's steadily declining. So my biggest concern is that sure we have all these non-traditional ways of working and all these kinds of things, which are great. But how long is that going to last? How long is it going to be until a point where we actually have to live similar to how we did back in the 1920s or even before that? Because that day is going to come. And that may even come a lot sooner than we might realize. So that's a big concern for me. I don't know. Like it's what kept me up at night. Actually, since high school, it kept me up at night for the last like 11 or so years. But it still keeps me up at night because I'm thinking, how do you survive at that point, right? When your entire life is going to be changed so different. I know that this might be a bit of a downer on what you were saying earlier, but it's something that really bothers me even till now. So
Yeah, I think you're bang on in that there is going to be a reversal. At some point, the credit and globalist system that we're part of, I mean, this is more, political and economical than anything else, but there's going to come a point where current credit habits and, the sheer level of globalism that's been sustained for the last 30, 40 years, like I would say from the beginning of the internet era on, right? Everything has kind of been this constant march towards digitization and, interglobal connectivity, if you will. And I think it's going to be super interesting because you're already seeing it just in terms of people's voting habits. You have these, very traditional, liberal, very immigrant friendly, traditionally countries in Central and Western Europe that are now electing nationalist right wing governments. That literally hasn't happened since World War II. And I think it's because as a society, people are at a point where there maybe is going to be a little bit of a desire to harken back to, I'm not saying bring back tuberculosis or anything crazy like that. Obviously, you want to maintain the science and tech and healthcare levels that we've achieved in the first world. We want to maintain that. But I think in terms of spending habits and just generally how the economy is run, there's going to be a push towards nationalism and bringing things back in-house for individual countries, because at a certain point, people are going to look around and go, oh my gosh, we have no manufacturing left in Canada or no manufacturing left north of the Mason-Dixon line in the US, right? There's going to be a shift. You're right. I think when I talk about non-traditional career paths, though, I just think people are resourceful. They're going to adapt, and whatever is available to them as a way to make money. And maybe it's a return back to manual labor. Maybe it's a return back to trades, right? You're seeing trades, people entering the trades are at an all-time low, and the people that are in them are out earning four-year degree graduates right now in Ontario. That's the reality. 2-year trade schools are going to go through the roof in terms of enrollment, and that's going to become a super viable career path again. But, big picture, I think there is going to be a complete collapse of our current kind of globalist credit system that's in place. Too much is bought and sold without actually having a cash value behind it. And I think that at some point, I don't know what it looks like, but I agree with you. I don't know if we'll vault all the way back to the 1920s, but I could certainly see a return to the prevailing nationalist winds that existed in the 50s and 60s. And I'd like to see that in Canada. I'd like to see people proud of being Canadian and maybe seeing a Canadian ethos that isn't apologetic or downplaying itself. You know what I mean? But that's a conversation for a different day. But I think that you're bang on, Amos, in terms of that's what's around the corner.
Yeah. It's I don't want to see us regressing in that sense to an era where knowledge isn't viewed as power, where knowledge is viewed as something that is not to be pursued. We're already technically seeing that in this day and age right now, but I don't want to see that go any further than that. If we are to return to an earlier way of living, it will be something positive, something like smaller communities.
Simplification.
Yeah.
Less time on devices. You're already seeing it with, phone-free coffee shops and breakfast spots, and, Snakes and Lattes is a super popular little chain here that's all about board games and old board games. And remember playing this as a kid. You're going to see people gravitate away from digital. I think we've already seen the peak of how much people want to be connected online. And you're going to start seeing people making a fundamental change in their lifestyles where they are having less screen time, where they're making a point of simplifying their lives. The less time I spend thinking about the world's problems or the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'm never going to come up with a solution to that. And devoting brain power and anxious energy to it isn't helpful. And so I've really made an earnest effort the last year or two on focusing on what's in front of me and enjoying the moment. And I've found that my mental state and my general level of satisfaction on a day-to-day basis in life has gone through the roof since I've done that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a family friend that I had about 10 years ago. He mentioned a really good point about social media and the state that it was in. You're really good at connecting with the rest of the world, but not with a person across the dinner table from you. And that's why, for me, it took me such a long time to even start using Instagram. I didn't start using it until this year, honestly, until 2023, I should say. Mm-hmm. And that was only because I wanted to build up a presence so I can build this podcast up. Because a podcast, unfortunately, has to be built on the realms of some kind of social media presence. Otherwise, you won't get any kind of attention. So, but that being said, I still value my time off social media very, very much. And you and I grew up at the time when Facebook was becoming the norm, when social media was becoming the norm, when it was around 2007, 2008, 2009. That era when it was the norm. So we're lucky in that we remember a life where we didn't have social media when we went out with our friends, when we biked, right? I remember James Duthie, he mentioned even back in his day in the 80s and 70s, really, his kids asked him, and his kids are only about like early 20s, so they're not that much younger than us, but even that difference is so fascinating because he said, my kids asked me, so how did you meet with your friends? We called them on their landline. Well, what if they didn't answer? Then you biked over to your house and hoped they were there. What if they weren't there? Well, we just go back to our own house and hope they were back the next day. It was that simple. It's not like nowadays where you have to, hey, you up on text, and you would expect and you would be so concerned if they were going to respond back to you on their texts, right? And that sort of anxiety, right? You don't have that kind of things nowadays, right? The relationships between people have been far more organic before 2007 to 2010, right? And we saw that. And even in our careers, the way how we built our careers up in sports, and in your case going into boxing, in my case going to law, it was very organic for the most part, right? It was that interpersonal relationship, that one-to-one conversation that many people in future generations or the next generation, the Gen Alpha generation, seem to be very, I don't want to talk with them. Even making a phone call is still considered, I don't want to say taboo, but scary for a lot of them. But for us, we were used to doing that, and we're used to stepping up on our feet and going out there and talking with them and, making the rounds, making connections at that point.
Well, I think we're at a point where management and C-level positions will be quite accessible for people in our age group in the next 5 to 7 years because of just the numbers generally in Canada, right? Population pyramid is an inverted triangle in Canada right now. You've got across every industry, you've got partners in law, you've got, private club general managers in my sphere that are retiring. And what's beneath them is not a ton of people. There's those opportunities will be very accessible to people that maybe 10, 15 years ago wouldn't have been considered, right? But in this day and age, if you can speak with people and you're able to have those interpersonal relationships and you're willing to be out there, especially in a sales, comms, marketing type role or agency, I think the sky is the limit for, communication friendly, let's say, interpersonal friendly people that are already in the workforce that have 5 to 10 years of experience behind them, right? Regardless of the industry, I think it's an exciting time with a lot of opportunities for people our age that have been on their professional journey for a few years and have that ability to interact with others and build relationships. I think there's going to be myriad opportunities moving forward.
Yeah, myriad of opportunities and hopefully a very, very positive horizon for the future of work in whatever industry as well. Well, as we begin to close this episode, what are your most important life lessons that you've learned that, aside from, your conversation with Marty Johnston, because that was also a very, very good piece of advice. Aside from that, what other pieces of advice and life lessons that you have learned and have received would you like to share with the audience?
I think the biggest one is just trying to find a balance. And it's something you don't even think about when you're 19 or you're 21 and you're pursuing your dream and you're grinding through, undergrad off to law school and you got to get a certain mark. And in my case, broadcasting, and you're on the road every weekend, or, it's really easy to be one dimensional at that point in time. And it's important not to let the relationships or the outside interests lag behind. I did, mine did 100%. When I first moved to Toronto, my entire life was the Canadian Football League and, trying to make rent in Toronto. I didn't see my family as much as I should have. I didn't keep up with my good friends the way that I should have. I certainly didn't have the art and politic and history interests that I do now, which I enjoy now. And I find myself fulfilled in a completely different way because I've dialed back the sports a little bit. Obviously, I'm still involved with the boxing, but on a day-to-day basis, I don't work in sports anymore. And that would have killed me 5-6 years ago. Now I'm grateful that I don't. I get more enjoyment out of it as a hobby or as a once a month thing, working a fight night at the casino, right? Then I get more enjoyment out of that than I did waking up on a Tuesday morning in January, checking my CFL email to see if some free agent had signed somewhere that I had to tweet about, right? It's much more enjoyable for me. It's much more wholesome for me now. And I just feel like I'm at a very good point in my life. So one would be, don't let other things drag in your life in the pursuit of one specific thing. And that ties back to the Marty Johnstonism about not putting all your eggs in one happiness basket. And the other one would be, really just taking care of yourself and those around you. And the conversations we've had around mental health in the sports space over my 5-6 years now since moving to Toronto have grown immensely. They're at a much better point because, unfortunately, like you said, so many people aren't here with us anymore. I know 2 or 3 people that aren't here anymore that I interacted with pretty regularly in the sports space. They were either players, other journalists, aspiring journalists, checking up on people, because at the end of the day, a job's a job. A living situation's a living situation. One relationship is one relationship. But if any of those things go sour or end, it doesn't have to mean that the rest of your life is over, especially at age 22, 24, 26. Men's mental health is something that we don't talk about enough. I'm lucky to have a super supportive family, a really good group of strong male friends. And as a result, if I ever did have something, I always knew that I had a group of people that I could go to and discuss things with, right? And I think that that's really, really important, right? Men's mental health specifically isn't talked about very, very much, not nearly enough. And that's why you still see it as a major thing that wipes out most of the people I know our age that have passed away. It was either a freak like car accident or construction accident or suicide. So making sure that you're checking up on the people around you. And if they're going through a tough time, picking up the phone and having a conversation. And if you're busy, loop back with them in a month, but just, make sure that you're keeping those lines of communication open. That's not really professional, but that's just life, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's life. And I think, even regardless of gender, it's just, as a human, I think that's just important, right? I mean, if there's one thing that social media allows you to do, especially with private messages, it's to check up on people and make sure they're genuinely okay, right? I have a very good friend who I checked up on because I saw a sign where I don't know. So I checked up and followed up with him over lunch, and it was fine. But you have to do these things in order to make sure that people are genuinely fine. Because, as you said, it's not tied. You should not tie your entire life's worth to your profession. You cannot. It's not just you should not. You must not, honestly.
Well, it's not sustainable, right? Over the course of a life, something could go south. Same thing with, a relationship. When you're 18 or 23 years old or whatever, it might seem like the end of the world, but it definitely is not. The sun will rise the next day. Even after, you get a pink slip from the CFL. Oh no, I've worked for this company for 4 years and we're going our separate ways. The sky was not falling. It was a beautiful day on that Monday. I went and had lunch with a buddy, and it was all good. And from that moment on, my life has genuinely been pretty much arrow up from that Monday in November of 2019. And I would never have imagined that when I moved to Toronto for a job, that my life would get better after moving on from the job I moved there for, but it did. And I think a lot of other people have had similar experiences, and it's important to have that perspective that, okay, I'm going to be here for 70 years or 80 years or hopefully 90 years. Whatever happened on this one day in this 1 year, or this 6-month period at work in 1 year, does not define an entire body of work over a life, right?
Right, exactly. Well, I can definitely say one thing, Carlos, your career has been an amazing one. After having known you for so many years, close to a decade, it's truly, truly a great career and a great story to tell. Carlos, thank you so much for coming on to the show and for telling us the living legend of Carlos Verde.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. And it's good to see you doing well, and good to see you still doing some announcing as well. It's amazing talking to you folks and people from back in the day, Cameron Penny, Ty McDonald, and realizing, wow, that was 8 or 9 years ago. And all those games we covered, their accountants, federal public servants, assistant coaches. Time marches on, but luckily, we've got a great full memory bank, and we're still finding some time to make new ones every couple weeks here.
Absolutely, yeah. And thanks again, Carlos, for coming on the show and for catching up with me after all these years. And thank you to our audience for tuning in to this episode of This is the Legend of. You have just heard or seen the living legend of Carlos Verde. You can find him on social media on Instagram at CVerde29. That's at CVERDE29. That's on Instagram. And also you can follow him on Twitter at Carlos77Verde. Once again, at Carlos77Verde. If you want to follow his work and all of his boxing announcing, as well as also York Club related work as well. And also be sure to follow us on social media and our website, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell notification icon so you won't miss any of our uploads. And follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcasting platforms. And if you want, you can donate to the show on www.thisisthelegendof.com/support. And if you want to be able to continue to support us there, that would be a great way to support us as well. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in to This is the Legend of. Signing off for now, this is Amos Vang. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.